If you enjoy sifting through a stack of papers looking for something that just might be relevant to you, then I have a fun video for you. Today we're going to go through all of the miscellaneous settings for Employee Central that are available on company system and logo settings and platform feature set. I don't think I would recommend this to the faint of heart. As a matter of fact, I think making people watch this might be against the Geneva Convention. But for those of you who want to stick around, have at it and let's get going. Okay, so this video is going to be a little bit different because the area of the system that we're going through is a little bit different. To be blunt here, there are a couple of transactions within SuccessFactors, one of which is called Company System and Logo Settings, and the other being platform settings. Both of these, I would just refer to them as dumping grounds of configuration. There's a whole bunch of checkboxes here. By my count, there's probably about 120 checkboxes in total across these two transactions, and they're not very well organized. And as a matter of fact, between the two transactions, I have a hard time explaining why some things are on one and some things are on the other. Really what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk step by step through these two transactions, and hopefully if you have any questions at some point in the future about what one of these settings does, by just going chronologically through this video, you should be able to get to these values. Now, I would recommend, obviously if you're watching this video, I would recommend trying to watch it through all the way the first time, just because that makes sure that you're aware of some of these settings. That it's been a while since I'd looked at these, and there were some that I'd completely forgotten about. So hopefully this will be useful for you now and as a reference. So let's get going. Okay, so we are in the first transaction, which is company system and logo settings. And to me, the easiest way to get here is to type in company system and logo settings. So now that we're here, you can see that it is a whole bunch of checkboxes, and there's some other things in here as well. But what I'm planning on doing is I'm just going to walk through these things little by little until we get to the end. The first item, Outlook calendar integration, is related to performance and not Employee Central, so we will not discuss it here. Next up is a big chunk of items I would like to discuss all at once, and that is all of the enabled centralized services items. Without going into a whole lot of detail here, because honestly, I don't pretend to be an expert in centralized services, although I've read plenty of KBAs on it and blogs. To me, the best way to describe centralized services is it is a new way of processing, and it's a more advanced way that SuccessFactors is providing to do some processing behind the scenes. And there are things such as validations that I think are improved by centralized services being enabled, but realistically, for you as an end user, the thing that you need to know is that centralized services, there's all of these settings, and I would use the checkbox and make sure that these are enabled in your system unless they cause some sort of issue. Why is that? Because eventually SAP is pretty clear that these centralized services are going to be standard and will be used across all of the centralized services. Will be something that will be used, and you won't have a choice in them. So you might as well just get used to them now. So I would suggest going ahead and enabling these centralized services, and if you run into any issues, then you start analyzing a little bit further. Enable forward propagation for compensation information. This one is useful if, for example, you are trying to load in a allowance. Maybe it's a car allowance or something like that into the employee's compensation record. If there is a future dated record on top of that compensation information, maybe there's a pay change or something like that, then your allowance could get wiped out unless you have this checkbox checked, which will make sure that allowance or that extra pay component, it would continue on with the following record. So that's what the forward propagation is all about. So this next item, attach data with email for import-export jobs. I could not find any documentation on this. Don't think I've ever had it checked. And when I say I can't find any documentation, I looked on help.sap.com and I did a KBA search, neither one of which came up with any results. I'm actually putting in a ticket with SuccessFactors on this point. So if I find out any information, I will update this video accordingly, potentially. This next item, suppress update of identical records during Employee Central import for supported entities. I would definitely recommend checking this one. So what this allows you to do is to do imports of data and not have to worry about just having two identical records on the same day with a 1 of 1 and a 1 of 2 and a 2 of 2. This one's definitely one to check if you're using EC. Send result email for job history, import and termination details, import follow-up processing, only if error occurred. What this is getting at is there is a email that gets sent out whenever we do an import of job history or termination details. And the email comes out a few minutes later, and it's basically just saying that if there are any follow-up activities for these two imports, it's given us an update on how those processes went. This checkbox, if you have it checked, then you're not going to get this email every time automatically. Instead, you're only going to get it if there was some error in the process. So it's just up to you on whether you want that one selected. Enable CSF support for address in emergency contact and personal relationships imports. So their CSF means country-specific fields. And for both emergency contact and dependents, whether or not you want to do some sort of generic load of emergency contact and personal relationships, which is basically dependents with generic address fields, then you would leave this unchecked. If you're loading emergency contacts with addresses or dependents with addresses, then I would definitely recommend checking this checkbox. Leave loading is Australia specific, and unfortunately I don't have a whole lot of information about leave loading, but there is some documentation that's out there. Next up is a interesting setting, and this is protect address from deletions. Employee address of following type cannot be deleted in the edit mode to ensure available for downstream processes. Basically what this means is that with this configured, if whatever subtype you choose here, then employees would not be able to delete that type of address off. And this is a problem. Without this setting, this can be a problem because there's no easy way to prevent deletion of subtypes inside the SuccessFactors, where if you want to allow, let's say, an employee to be able to delete their mailing address, it's really hard to prevent them from also being able to delete the home address. And the problem is that the business rules don't get triggered, so you can't use a business rule to say, hey, you can't delete your home address. So this setting is one I would highly recommend to always have it set so that you can prevent deletion of your home address for your regular employees. I'm going to address the next two items together. Enable validations for mandatory fields in the dependents and emergency contacts details section. So for both dependents and emergency contacts, there is a header section where you put in some basic details, and then below there's a little link to go to a details section for these elements. And so, for example, for emergency contact, you're within the details section, you may have address, for example. And so what this is getting at is with these checkboxes checked, that means that if I go in, for example, on emergency contact and just try to put in just some summary information like name, relationship, and phone number, and I press save, I would get an error message if this checkbox is checked. So basically what this is asking is, do you want to bypass any required fields on the details? In other words, do you want to make sure that the end user or the processor, whoever is filling in this information, is always filling in the details as well? So that's what this checkbox. Okay, wanted to address this last chunk of configuration elements from this section of the transaction together. So these are all whether or not we want to enable some specific validations. So there's address validation, national ID, bank, work permit, and payment information. So for each of these, there can be some country-specific validations, particularly, for example, on national ID, maybe you've got some validations related to the type of social security number or national ID number that you have. And this is whether or not you want to make sure that everything that is put in follows those different validations. And obviously, the right answer for this is to go ahead and start out with all of these validations checked. And then if for some reason you need to prevent one of these validations validations from happening because of whatever reason. Maybe there's some validation in SuccessFactors that doesn't actually line up with what your data is that you're putting in for some reason, then you can always uncheck this. But otherwise, I would recommend starting out with these checkboxes all checked, and that's what I usually do as well. Disable filter for custom fields of type foundation object. To be honest with you, I looked at the documentation on this, but I still can't really understand why you would need to do this. I never have said it, and you probably won't either. Okay, I'm going to address both of these next two settings together. Ignore FTE during compa ratio and range penetration calculation, and then calculate range penetration or compa ratio even if FTE and standard weekly hours are null. Standard weekly hours and FTE are both involved in compa ratio and range penetration calculations. And by using these checkboxes, what SuccessFactors is allowing us to do is, even if we are not using those fields for whatever reason in the customer system, then by clicking these checkboxes, then it's going to pretend as if you are a full-time employee and will just do the calculations as if the FTE equals 1. So that is the idea behind these two settings. Hide external users from search results. External users would be things like LMS has external users, and onboarding 2.0 also has external users. So this is obviously whether you want to include those types of users within the search results. Enable login with old username in case of a rehire with new employment. So this one is relatively self-explanatory, but just to give you a little bit more of a technical explanation, when you do rehire with new employment, you create a new user ID and a new username slot in the system. Technically speaking, you should be using whatever the new username is for the new employment, but with this setting set, you can make it so that people don't have to know what their new username is, and they can just use whatever the old username was. Enable target group based filtering for worker fields. Yes, that is a mouthful. So what is this getting at? What are worker fields? Worker fields are things like a supervisor field, for example, on the employee's record. This is basically saying, do you want to make it so that people can only choose values for worker fields based off of the security that you have set up in the system? So in other words, are you going to full wide open access so that people can choose whomever, or is this going to be limited down to just the people that the given user is permissioned for? These next 4 items are all related to performance management, so we're going to skip them. That also includes the do not store senders comment on workflow action. That sure sounds like it is related to Employee Central, but it is not. Skip workflow steps with duplicate approver. I'm just going to read directly from the release notes on this one because it'll be clearer that way. After customers enable skip workflow steps with duplicate approver in company, system, and logo settings, the steps immediately close to each other and having the same single approver, except the last one of them, are automatically skipped. These steps are marked as skipped on the workflow participants dialog and in the activity of the workflow details page. Only the last step of these consecutive steps need to be processed. By skipping the other steps, customers can shorten a long approval chain, improving efficiency. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is it says the same single approver. So if you have someone who is the approver of one step, and then the next step there's that same approver plus a couple of other people are the approvers, then this setting will not apply, and you would have to have both steps of approval. Allow delegates to accept or reject flow delegation requests. That one's pretty self-evident. Allow manager or HR rep to autocomplete the routing steps. Routing steps means it is performance management based. Hide the personal password tab from users. There is an option menu option for employees to be able to set their own passwords, and this decides whether you want to prevent users from managing their own password. This option allows a company-wide setting on whether users will receive email notifications. If checked, all users will receive email on all workflow-related processes. If not checked, each user has an option to turn notification on/off. So that's fairly self-explanatory. The only other thing to add is that the setting where you allow users to turn off their own notifications is in the option menu for the user. All right, I'm going to skip several items here, either because they are related to other areas outside of Employee Central or they are self-explanatory. Okay, these next three I want to talk about together. Allow users to turn off org chart caching, allow multiple languages in org chart content. I've never really actually used either of those two, but they're self-explanatory. This last one, though, I do want to talk briefly about, and that is allow overrides of default display in organizational charts. Apparently, when I did some digging on this one, it looks like you can go, if you have the setting set, you can actually set the order of subordinates underneath the manager. That seems like it's opening quite a can of worms, so I don't know that I would necessarily recommend that one. Show custom relationships and company org charts. This allows you to include additional things like custom manager as dotted line relationships in the org chart. Disable browser photo caching. That one's pretty self-explanatory. Pull product feedback in page header. This one was one I was not aware of, but in the page header in SuccessFactors, there's now feedback loop so that you can provide feedback and the end users can provide feedback directly to SuccessFactors. Be curious to see how that's being used, to be honest. Disable Fiori 3 base theme, pretty self-explanatory. Enable dual calendar. This is for Arabic and Thai locales. There is a dual calendar process for those folks. Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with it, so I can't speak much more to that. Hide country region flag from the UI. If you've noticed in global information, there is a little place where the flag of the country appears, and this is whether perhaps you want to turn that off for some reason. Sanitize rich text inputs. It sounds like that this is some sort of security check that you can put in. Enable contingent worker jobs. So this is not really very explanatory of what it actually is. So the contingent worker job, what this allows you to do is if you have a contingent worker who is managing employees within your organization or any kind of subordinates underneath in your organization, you need to click this checkbox if you want. Otherwise, what happens is when the contingent worker terminates, the employees that are being supervised don't get moved to other employees. By checking this checkbox and then running the BizX daily processing job, then those that were otherwise being assigned to that contingent worker get reassigned. Okay, a little over halfway done here. Good job, people. Let's keep this up. We're almost done with all of these obscure configuration settings. Let's get going with part 3. So first up is enable position-based background information blocks. As we've talked about before, there is a possibility of either adding new employment or there is such a thing as concurrent employment where you could have two jobs at once within SuccessFactors. In both of these cases, the background portlets, things like education, work experience, those are things that typically only pertain to one or other of your assignments. But for a lot of companies, this doesn't make sense and you want to have these blocks, these education, work experience, things like that, to be shared between the two assignments. And so this setting allows you to just have one, basically share those things like education, work experience, certifications, and the like between your two assignments instead of having them tracked individually. Display unrated ratings in the live profile. That's not relevant for us. Disable directory search for all users. So directory search is something that's actually under company information. It's a thick view that looks like an old directory search, as the name implies. I don't know why I would necessarily disable this. I find the directory search useful in some cases where I want to just do a quick search and pull everybody, say, from a given location. So I wouldn't recommend disabling directory search. Same with disable certain fields for directory search. Unless you are not using a field and you think it's going to cause some confusion, I would just not disable any fields on directory search. Next 3 settings are not relevant for EC, so we're going to skip over those. This next one is relatively new. Enable the name format selected and configure people profile to apply globally. So there is an entire name format configuration process that you can use. You can have different name formats based on your legal entity, which of course is tied to your country. However, if you want to just simplify things, you can just use enable the name format and configure people profile, because there is a name format and people profile. Presumably you could just use this setting and avoid having to set up the name profile in the legal entity. So I have not actually tried this one myself, but this one looks intriguing and plan on using it on my next project. Hi, job title in people search in org charts. That one's pretty self-explanatory, so I won't say anything more. Show all active employments and for concurrent assignment and global and concurrent employment. And normally this would be something you would want full visibility to all active assignments. Okay, this next one is really useful, and that is show current absence status. Who can see the current absence status? Inside of SuccessFactors, we have both time off and leave of absence, and both of those generate a banner across the top if you are out of the office. And this setting right here says which permission groups do we want to prevent from seeing someone's current absence status. So if you set this to none, this means that pretty much anyone can see absence status. So that if they did a search, they would know that someone's out on leave of absence. So typically I would set this to none because it does make sense to let people know if they are within the company that someone is out. Now, if you select from that drop down, you'll see all the permission groups. So you could cherry pick to say these are the groups that I actually want to have access to see the absences. So if you need to limit it down, say you don't want all the employees to see it, then you can uncheck that permission group. So that's what this one is getting at. Show an active user in people search requires role-based permission. I have some customers that use this and some that do not. So what this means is that if you are, first of all, you have to be permissioned to see inactive users. That's for starters. So normally like employees will not be able to see other former employees in the system. So it would be just typically like HR admins that would be able to see it. The question is whether they need to see it within the people search or not. So if you don't, if the answer is yes, then they would search for Smith, they would see every Smith that has ever worked with the company. But if you uncheck that, then they would only see, if they go to the people search, the people that have the currently active Smiths. But there is another search that is available to you that has the ability to do inactive searches, and that's the little search box that comes underneath the employee's name inside the people profile. So it just basically tucks away the inactive search to something that's a little bit out of the way, as opposed to having it where it's clogging up the full, true, normal people profile search. So typically I would recommend leaving this one unchecked. Search for people by additional keywords. I normally use this. So I guess if you want to be able to search for people based on their job title, this would be something that this would allow you to do. Search for people by Employee Central name fields. Yes, please. Enable fuzzy search function for people search. I don't recommend this one because what ends up happening is it's trying to guess at what you're actually trying to search for, and what ends up happening is you'll end up with way more search results than you want. So I would definitely not recommend this one. Enable Show Me. So Show Me is something that's been around for a long time, and it allows you to provide tutorials to end users on how things work. This doesn't work real well in Employee Central because this is really page specific, and we have one page for all of people profile. And so Show Me doesn't really work because there's too much going on that one page to be able to do much of a Show Me. Do not overwrite the manager field when it contains no manager value in the user input file. I couldn't actually find any documentation on this, but my guess is when this would be used is if you were doing some sort of user import that didn't necessarily always include the user's manager, and you wanted to make sure that if they had an actual manager assigned already within SuccessFactors and you were doing some sort of import, that did not override their existing manager assignment. Disable presentations folder in homepage, not relevant for us, so we'll skip it. So show getting started help videos on homepage. This is, of course, as the name implies, you can just go in and create videos that help users get in on how to use SuccessFactors. Some companies use it, but I would think most companies do not. Hide global navigation menu, module picker. This is to obviously the home menu, and if you wanted to get rid of that for some reason, you can do that. Use system-generated password. This is not really relevant anymore because if you go through IAS, either for single sign-on or for your logins, then this setting does not apply to you. Okay, a lot of this section are things that are either not relevant for Employee Central or so obscure that we really just don't want to cover, but there's a couple I want to hit. So the first one is next person ID assigned. So there's two ways to do employee numbering. The one that is used by default is this setting right here. So you put in whatever number you want the auto numbering for your hires to go through. So that is one way to do it. There is another way called where you go through manage data, hired, rehire higher configuration where you can set up a business rule if you want to have a little bit more control over how the numbering works. So that is the other option. But most companies, I think most companies probably just end up with next person ID assigned as the option that they use. Okay, the last one I want to look at on this screen is default event reason to use when processing direct reports and job relationships online. What this is related to, based on what I could read in the documentation, is there is this process called automated hierarchy adaptation. This process happens when your hierarchy and employee hierarchy are out of sync for whatever reason. You can set up a process so that it runs overnight and it will make the supervisor relationships on the employee information look like whatever the hierarchy looks like on the position side. So this setting right here that you see is basically asking you what event reason you want to use if the hierarchy gets adjusted during that process. And so normally what you would want to choose here is something like a supervisor change event reason. So hopefully that makes sense. So congratulations, we have knocked out the company and logo system settings. Now it is time to do platform feature settings. So just like with company, system, and logo settings, and I'm sorry, I can't ever remember exactly what the phrasing is on that, so apologize if I'm getting that inaccurate. But if you type in logo, actually, you'll get where you need to go. Likewise, on this next transaction, the one we're going to look at now, all I really need to remember is to type in the word platform, and then I will get taken to platform feature settings. And so this is another set. I think it's around 25 settings. Again, I can't really tell why some things show up on platform and some things show up on company system settings. But regardless, it's good to know all of these. Let's dive in now and try to go through these one by one. Live profile has been around for several years now. It was by and large replaced by people profile, but I'm sure that we still need to keep this enabled. Keep that checkbox checked. Enable Qualtrics feature. I am not a Qualtrics expert, but I do find it fascinating and think it's an excellent addition to SuccessFactors. And as you add it into your system, you follow the documentation and put that in place. But it's not 100% relevant for EC, so I'm going to skip it for now. User directory, I would keep that one enabled. Send welcome message. So this is for imports only. And actually there's also another setting in basic information where you would decide whether you want to send the welcome messages. So I'm assuming you'd have to have both of these, this and the one and the employee imports checked in order to send out welcome messages in bulk. Hide username in UI. So by default, when you go into SuccessFactors and you search for someone, beside their name, you'll see in parentheses their username. And so you can easily, if you determine that you don't want that to show up, you can just check this checkbox. These next two are not really relevant for Employee Central, so I'm going to skip them. Hide peers. This is a kind of obscure place, but if you go into the employee profile and you look up someone and then you look at their header and you click on the little drop-down arrow next to their name, there is a little box that'll show up. One thing that'll show is the manager, and it'll also show all the peers for that given employee. If for some reason you don't want that shown, then you can click this checkbox and the peers section of that goes away. Automatically copy external code to non-unique external code. I would definitely recommend doing that one. Display all expanded duplicate records. When you look at the help for this one, it says contact professional services before you enable this. So I'm going to just assume that we probably need to skip this, ignore it, and make sure you don't check it. Enable Upgrade Center permission. I would definitely recommend this. This allows you to control who can go into the Upgrade Center and start upgrades for specific pieces of functionality. Enable Business Process Engine. This is used a lot in Onboarding 2.0, for example. You would probably enable this by default, and there's no reason not to. Use process job identity and use process definition creator identity. Given the use of the word process, I believe that this has to do with onboarding 2.0, so we're going to skip these now. Specify user identity. Again, can't find any documentation on it. I'm guessing it's probably for onboarding, but your guess is as good as mine. Unified pick list management. I would say just leave this one alone. Add permission, view completed workflows. This one would come into play if you want to prevent people from being able to seek those after the process had been completed. Enable 4 eyes principle on workflow step approval. Okay, so this one's pretty important, and I'll talk through this one real quick. So 4 eyes principle means that the initiator cannot be their own approver. So there's some caveats with this. The main one being that if the approver is an approver role that is not a dynamic role, then the user is able to do their own approval. So this 4 eyes approval principle only applies if it is the first step in the approval process or the only step in the approval process. And that next step is for a dynamic group or a dynamic role. In other words, if I'm the initiator, but I'm also in like an HR admin group that is the approver for the workflow, then I cannot be the one to approve that workflow. It is meant to prevent cases where you've got multiple approvers, but you're going to the one person who is initiating the change for themselves, or they're just initiating the change for whomever they're initiating, that they are also not able to initiate and approve. Gonna go over the next two together. Per company encryption and security scan of user inputs. These are technical in nature, and so we're really not going to cover these with respect to Employee Central, but if you need to find out more information on these, there's probably some information on the help guides. Enable dynamic group definition report. So if you want to be able to run reports that show who all is in a specific dynamic group, then you need to check this box. And what it does is it causes a batch job to run nightly to make sure that you have a listing of all of the people that are part of a dynamic group. So this does the work for you ahead of time in batch. So you need to make sure that you check this if you want to run those types of RBP reports. Enable the custom field of data privacy consent statements. That one's self-explanatory and also not something that Employee Central itself typically will be involved with, so we're going to skip that one. Enable homepage v3 dynamic custom tiles. That is probably at least 2 homepages ago, so we're going to skip it. Exclude assignment ID column from the user data template. Assignment ID was added a couple of years ago so that you could have something that kind of is a replacement for user ID that could be used in case you need to be able to change someone's primary ID that you're sending to downstream systems. So that's the reason for assignment ID. So if you're just using user ID, you could just check this box if you wanted to, but otherwise I would keep assignment ID out there. It's something that may be useful for you in the future. Enable SuccessFactors e-signature. This is something that really is in use mostly in onboarding, so we'll skip that. Enable secondary login feature. Okay, so this is an important one. So the secondary login feature is a way, it used to be managed support access, but basically what this allows you to do is with secondary login, this is how you can set up so that someone from SuccessFactors can go in through provisioning and get access to your system so that they can do support. So first you would have to set this checkbox to yes, or check the checkbox. Then you go to manage support access, and then you can assign a user that the SuccessFactors team can use in order to log in. But of course, this is the first step in that process. So I would say this gets checked so that you can allow for support, SuccessFactors support, to get into your system. Okay, we are at the end. The very last setting here is disable built-in support. So this is just the little support tab that's off to the side, whether you want it or not. And so that checkbox, you can decide what to do with it. Okay, so that is it. I'm going to go take a nap now and hope everyone has survived this without any